All right, guys, so a little RDL tutorial for you here. Nothing crazy structured, me just touching on some points that I think are gonna be of interest to most people. So the things I'm gonna cover is first about setup. So how do you determine some of your best setup? Where should you do stance with? Some of the things you should be thinking about as far as the joints involved, your torso. Then once I talk about that, I'm gonna get a little bit into range of motion. So what should you be thinking about as far as range of motion? Where should the plates be relative to the ground? How do I get more range of motion? Stuff like that. And then at the end, I'm even gonna talk a little bit about bands. Because again, I'm filming this video as the start of my workout today. I have a little bit more of a hip dominant lower body day. So I'm starting with banded RDLs. Anytime bands go on anything, people feel some feels. But really for my end, I always say most people make a bigger deal out of bands than I do. One of those things where, again, if it's easy, quick setup, if it doesn't piss you off, for the most part, done properly, will make an exercise more efficient. So make it a more even challenge over the range of motion. And again, pretty much for everyone in the gym, the whole reason you're picking up weights is to challenge your muscles, to make them produce force. And really, I don't see any point of going through range of motion that's not a challenge. So that's things that people don't talk about. Yes, more range of motion is important, but only if there's really a challenge from what you're using that matches that range of motion. So that's really what bands are all about. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is just a couple things for setup, a couple things to think about, and then again we'll get into some of the other points after there. So as far as setup, the first thing I say is stance. Again, keeping all this relatively simple, try and have this stuff quick, usable, not too much nuance or detail, but for the most part, a similar stance you would take to basically your squat is going to be a pretty good place to start. So again, for most people, it's going to be hip width. And now realize there's going to be a little bit of variability one way or the other. Literally the shape of your hip and how it sits in the socket, the way that acetabulum sits, so the way basically the joint of your hips, some people's hips point more out, some people's joints point more forward. Literally like the neck of your femur is a little bit different from person to person. So all that being said, you don't have to know, but for some people, they can go this very narrowish stance and they have a ton of hip flexion and it feels great. Reality is you figured out whatever that means for structure, this is a better position for you. Some people just going a little bit wider, even turning the toes out a little bit, will feel way more hip flexion. And again, realize that's just a little bit of variability from somewhere narrow to a little bit wider, to even a teeny bit wider with toes pointed out. Find what's comfortable to you. You don't want to turn it into a massive sumo deadlift, which is really going to start to limit range of motion and involve putting some more stuff behind the joint, aside from glutes and hams. So again, stick within a reasonable range. Again, if kind of narrow would be hip width, a little bit wider there, a little bit wider there. Probably for most people, that's going to be it. Focus on good contact and broad contact with the foot. So again, I don't think it's wrong to have a little bit more load on the heel, but the reality is the more surface area you have with the parts of your feet that are supposed to be touching the ground, the better you're going to be. So I would just say imagine the whole from heel all the way through outside of the foot and through the toes. You want that kind of grip in the ground, nice and tight. And again, if you have a little bit of weight shifted to your heels and that helps you put your hips back, fine. But I don't like it to the point where literally people will have their toes and balls of the feet coming off of the ground. I think that'll actually take away from output. From there, as far as knees are concerned, as you're going through the range of motion, just keep them relatively fixed. They do not have to be locked completely straight. In fact, for most people, I'd say that's not a great idea. They can have a soft bend. And as you go through the range of motion, if they bend a little bit, in my opinion, it's not a huge deal. Again, how much is a little bit? I'm not going to put in exact degrees on it because it doesn't matter, just understand the concept. That if it turns into a conventional deadlift at some point in time, obviously you're defeating the point of the exercise. So again, if you're really good at keeping your knees a slight bend and not having them bend at all, great, kudos to you. But if you're working your ass off and they bend a couple degrees, I don't think you're really diminishing the effects of the exercise. And then lastly, before the next part of the video, I'm going to talk more about range of motion, what occurs at your hips, is get very good at bracing. I'll touch on this a little bit later. If you want more range of motion, bracing, hip mobility, great places to start. And then bracing is also massively important for protecting your back, arguably having the musculature of your torso working the way it's supposed to. So the most simple explanation, again, there are people that teach entire weekend seminars longer than that on proper breathing and bracing. So this is not an all-encompassing, but one of the easiest and simplest things I had for most people is take a breath in through your nose, a big breath. Make sure you feel that your belly button is going out when you take that breath. So it's not ribs up and down, it's belly button out. Once you have a big breath kind of in your stomach, react as if someone was going to punch you in the stomach. Brace everything. It's not just your rectus abdominis, your six-pack abs. It's all of the musculature of your torso bracing hard. Again, not just rectus abdominis, not just internal external obliques, not just TVA, even lats, erectors, all that stuff should brace hard. That's the position you want to maintain the entire time. So again, ideally, when you're going through RDLs, your spine shouldn't move. So the range of motion will basically end when your spine is just about to start to go into flexion. So I can touch the ground really easily and all that kind of stuff, but all that's coming from spinal flexion. Again, more so from a safety standpoint, you want your erectors working, but not going through motion. You want them stabilizing and locking your spine and torso nice and still. And again, that comes from every single muscle basically that crosses over your vertebra, which again, is a lot of people think about that core torso stuff, but includes things like lats, all the erectors, all the way from the base of your hips, basically all the way up to the top of your neck. So that's hopefully some relatively simple things to think about with setup, things to think about as far as what your joints should be doing. And then we'll talk a little bit about, range of motion, bands, and some more stuff after that, and hopefully watch some working sets as we go along. All right, guys, just want to talk a little bit about RDLs and specifically the range of motion you should use when doing RDLs. And this is one of those things, people say it, and I agree with it, it's accurate, but I want to just kind of elaborate on it a little bit, that your range of motion is going to be individual specific. So just because someone does RDLs a certain way or a certain range of motion doesn't mean you should do the same. And why is that? Not just the obvious of, what are we really training here? It's basically a hip exercise. That's the main mover. Of course, erectors are kind of the next in line for doing the most work. But as far as hips are concerned, everyone kind of knows, oh, my hips are either more or less flexible than someone else, so that should determine my range of motion. Yes, but a lot of people when they're doing exercises like this, they use the ground as a reference for the range of motion. Like, are the plates touching the ground? Am I stopping half an inch off the ground, an inch off the ground, and trying to get more range of motion relative to the ground? And I just want to take a step back and realize, starting with anything, plate diameter is arbitrary, right? So people like to think of exercises like RDLs and deadlifts as primal. That doesn't mean the people that originally designed, the diameter of plates got together with cavemen or something and figured out, oh, here's exactly where it should be to be as primal or as functional as possible. Aside from the fact that there's nothing functional or primal about an RDL, right? If you're going to pick something up off the ground, you would never do it straight legs and try and use just your hips. You'd use your quads, you'd use the rest of your lower body as well too. That's a little tangent. So realize first off, plates touching the ground is arbitrary. Someone said, hey, this is the diameter of the plates, specifically with where the bar goes through, basically the radius-ish, half of the plate diameter is really what determines, where you're gonna end up relative to the ground. So one, plates are arbitrary. Two, realize even if two people have the same range of motion at the hips, so we're just talking straight leg hip flexion, so even if someone can get to 90-ish degrees, well, what happens? So for me, if you watch when I do RDLs, I've got what most people consider a pretty good range of motion. Plates get, sometimes they tap the ground, half inch off the ground, whatever. But realize that when I get to this position at the bottom, what affects this position? One is how long my arms are. So again, everyone can watch and say, oh, he's got good range of motion on his RDLs. Well, what happened if my entire arm was an inch shorter? Nothing would change as far as my hip musculature is concerned, my erectors are concerned. The plates would stop, just an inch off the ground as opposed to touching the ground, or an inch and a half off the ground as opposed to half an inch off the ground. And someone would say, oh, he should go lower, he should touch the ground. That's just one example of just, again, the length of my arm, which there's a lot of discrepancy from person to person, would change someone's perception of, oh, look, he's got full range of motion, good job. Oh, no, he's stopping an inch and a half off the ground, he should go lower. And again, as far as my hips and my erectors are concerned, nothing changes. Same amount of torque at all those joints all the way up, same amount of work. Again, just if you're using the ground and plates as a reference, someone's gonna look at it and say, oh, that's not as much range of motion. What about legs? So again, if I'm in this position, well, what happens if my legs are an inch longer? Everything's basically gonna be lift up an inch off the ground. Or the same the other way around of that. Someone stops like, oh, he's got short range of motion. Well, his arms are an inch longer, and all of a sudden he's got good range of motion. So again, realize, one, yes, hips are going to be different from person to person, so not everybody can fold as half as well as others. But also realize things like leg length, arm length will affect where those plates end up relative to the ground, and really shouldn't be a factor at all in determining how low you go on an RDL. So the main thing you should focus on, if something actually matters, you're going to do more work the closer your spine gets perpendicular to the ground. The closer your spine gets, parallel to the ground, the further away your hips will be from the bar path, and the further away all your erectors will be from the bar path. Whenever there's a greater distance, that horizontal distance from bar path to joints, that determines what's really doing the most work, which really equates to the most torque. So if you were actually going to have an arbitrary goal, it's how close can I get my spine to parallel to the ground. That's the position where technically you're doing the most work. But so realize where the plates end up is going to be different. Someone, they might stop half an inch short or 2 inches short. They could be doing the same amount of work as someone that goes to the floor. Realize someone, depending on their limb length and having crazy range of motion at the hips, maybe they should actually be on a deficit. So they should actually stand on something that's half an inch taller or an inch taller just to do the same amount of work that someone that's stopping on the ground or an inch above. So again, if you're really thinking about what range of motion should I do, the reality is you should forget about the weight, forget about your hands, forget about where the plates end up. Push your hips back. As soon as your hips run out of range of motion, and as soon as your spine wants to start to round to bring the bar lower, that's the end. And wherever it is what it is. And if you want to improve hip flexion, watch some of the things I was doing in between sets there as I went through warming up. Improving hip range of motion, one, you can train straight leg hip flexion, I think is a good idea. Train hip internal, external rotation, and then work on core. All the stuff I was doing really isn't correcting or fixing anything. It's just contractions. The same reason you would warm up anything, the same reason you do 4 warm-up sets before a top set, I'm doing specific kind of strategic contractions that are going to help open up my range of motion. And I find that when I do hip internal, external rotation, straight leg hip flexion, and I work on things that help me breathe and brace, you'll see I was doing some belly breathing, dead bug variation. Those things are really, I found, probably have the most direct effect on basically how much range of motion I have at the hips. Obviously working on hips, and again, the more stable and braced my torso is, arguably my body will sometimes allow more range of motion at the hips. So just some stuff to think about next time you're doing RDLs. Forget about all the arbitrary stuff, because again, plate size is arbitrary. You didn't have any say in that. Leg length, arm length, last time I checked, you didn't have any say in that either. So focus on your hips, focus if anything on your spine or torso position relative to the ground. And again, if you want to get that closer to parallel to the ground, work on bracing, work on getting more control and tension through the midsection, and then work on things specific to hip range of motion. All right, guys, so just going to talk real quick because I'll get some questions on it. What's the point of bands? Why bother with bands? And you guys are in for a treat today. I'll do a little side rant on this as well, too. But the short answer for bands is there's certain exercises, deadlifts being a great example, squat patterns being a great example, where there essentially is like a stacking effect. So if we were looking from the side on an exercise and you just imagine the bar path, that's basically the line of force. So the whole reason we're holding a bar is because we want the force from it. If you look at that line of force and you look at how far horizontally away from that bar path the joints we're trying to train are, the further away they are, the more torque there is. And so really, I know every time I say the word torque or I say moment arms, I'm just trying to be accurate. I know that sounds kind of nerdy. Who the hell cares about that? Well, the reason that matters is because your body doesn't recognize just weight. It recognizes weight multiplied by moment arms, which is the distance, and that equates to torque. When you do something that feels hard, that's the main reason it feels hard. I always use the easy example of a lateral raise. Moving a dumbbell 6 inches down here, even though it's the same weight, even though it might be the same 6 inches, isn't the same as moving a dumbbell here, the same weight, the same 6-inch distance. The only difference is the weight hasn't changed, is the length of the moment arm. And then as a result of bigger the moment arm, bigger the distance. You don't have to know exact numbers, couldn't matter less, the more torque there is. So anytime you're going through a range of motion of an exercise and joints get very close to that line of force, they essentially stack like the top of a squat, the top of a deadlift. Basically from the bottom to the top, everything keeps getting closer and closer and closer. And that's why you have basically the top of those exercises are much easier. That's why all over gyms in the world, you'll see people quarter squatting at the top when they're cheating, not quarter squatting at the bottom. Same distance isn't the same effect, the same torque, again, because of that moment arm thing. So I know that's a little long-winded, but it's as concise as I can keep it. If you have more interest in that, Google the terms, torque, moment arms. I think I got a video or two up on my page. If that's up there, look for that. But again, it's nothing I made up, just explaining an effective exercise. So for a deadlift, for a squat, because it gets easier as you come through the range of motion, as you come to the top, as you go through the concentric, by adding a band, you can offset that a little bit. Basically, again, because that torque is weight times moment arm, as you go to the top and moment arms get smaller and smaller and smaller, well, you can increase the weight as you go up to kind of offset that effect. So whenever anyone is properly using bands on a deadlift, on a squat, that is the main reason that they use them, is to offset that stacking effect, to keep torque more consistent to the top. Again, there's a little bit different applications for powerlifting or for any sport where it's concerned about power, speed. Speed is not a concern in the bodybuilding world. For bodybuilding, it's more about just even torque, which equates to more even force production, which is what really drives muscle growth. So that's the whole goal here, is to make the entire range of motion more challenging, arguably make the exercise more efficient. That being said, if you can't use it, it's not a big deal. Nowhere in this video did I say it's so much better that normal squats, normal deadlifts are bad. Of course not. They're great. But the further along you get in your training journey, I would argue efficiency is a big deal. So the more efficient you can get with your training, the better results ultimately you're gonna have. And it's kind of a necessity as you're approaching that point of diminishing returns. So if you didn't see how I had it there, basically I'm lucky that this gym has a deadlift platform, and my 40 gym has a deadlift platform. So you can just put bands right over top. That's what those are made for. I understand that not everyone has that. I apologize. If you don't, here's the easy hack that you can do, is you can just put the band over top of the bar. So the trick here, place it right over the bar, try and even it up on the bar, and then you're gonna step in the same width stance you're going to have. So again, if this is about my stance, you wanna do your best to make sure that the sides here have even. So you can see this one's a little loose, this one's a little tight. So maybe I'll try and loosen this one just a little bit. And yeah, now we're pretty close. So get it close enough. Even stance, same as you normally would. Then have these on an even spot on the bar. Take your hands just outside of it. And again, whatever, if you're just doing a normal deadlift, you could use that. Or same as I was doing, if you want to do an RDL, hips back, hips forward, you're going to get the same effect. And again, this is obviously an easy one. Deadlift platforms are expensive. Not every gym has them. A band is the cost of a band over top of the bar. Take 2 minutes for setup, and not that big of a deal. Side rant. Anytime you put bands on something, again, there's some psychology effect, so if somebody knows it, feel free to let me know. Someone doesn't understand something or see something that, I don't know, makes them feel some feels, they just basically want to just kind of bash it. So a lot of time people see bands on stuff, they say, oh, don't overcomplicate things, don't reinvent the wheel. My side rant on that is, all I'm doing is doing this one small thing that takes 5 seconds to make an exercise better. The same people that are saying, don't overcomplicate things, don't make something or manufacture something different for efficiency. Everything you use in the gym was built in a factory. It literally took engineers and probably hundreds of people involved in the process, from conceptualization of the idea, to actually manufacturing it and putting it in your hands. So some people like this notion or this argument of, oh, keep things basic, keep things primal, don't overcomplicate shit. Everything you use in the gym is complicated, unless you're literally out in your backyard picking up logs, picking up rocks off the ground, and using that shit to lift. I'll give it to you, kudos, you are definitely more functional. But if you're in a gym and you're using a barbell with plates that are calibrated, you use a leg press, a hack, unless you made that yourself, then you're using complicated stuff that you needed literally hundreds of people to be involved with to get into your hands. So when you get butthurt over me taking 5 minutes to make something myself with one band, again, that takes a couple seconds, realizing that you don't have consistent principles all across everything you do in the gym. Again, unless you're at home right now lifting up shit outside with rocks and logs. Congratulations, you are definitely more primal and more of a caveman than me. So anyway, hopefully for anyone actually interested in that, all that kind of stuff helps. And again, if nothing else, give it a shot. I know, again, the first time you set stuff up, is a pain in the ass. You got to overcome just the obstacle of taking a couple extra seconds. The easy part is once you do it the first time, you figure out, okay, how do I get this band on here? How do I stand on it? It's cake. It takes 5 seconds. Do you like it? Is it more efficient? Are you getting better results with it? Kudos to you. Keep it in and move forward. But if you don't like it, it's a pain in the ass. If it just puts you in a grumpy ass mood to do it, that's all good reasons. If you don't like putting bands on shit because it makes you grumpy before you do the exercise, that is a legitimate good reason not to do it. But again, just don't make up stupid shit that again isn't going to be a consistent thought process through everything you decide to or not to use in the gym. And as always, guys, hopefully all those tips for RDLs help. Most importantly, hopefully it actually improves your training, improves your ability to make training decisions, and ultimately improves your results. So if you find this stuff helpful, you find it not helpful, just let me know your feelings down below in the comments section. That's the place to put your feelings. But seriously though, give me some feedback. If you like it, give me that thumbs up. If you're new here, hit that subscribe. Trying to get my content going a little bit more regularly. And as always, as much as you share this, is probably the best compliment you can give me for any of my content is telling others about it. So again, hit that thumbs up, hit that subscribe. Until the next one.